Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, tap or mouse over the video playback area of the screen and use the chapter titles to guide you to the section of the video where you'd like to jump. Use the gear icon at the bottom of the playback screen to slow down or increase the video playback speed. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have returned to working on my reverse engineered sweater. I have a plan for dyeing some hand spun yarn, and I have a new sewing project that is destined to keep me humble. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me from Bernadette on Ravelry. It's an article about an event going on in Ayrshire in the UK this week through Sunday, July 10th. It's called the Library of Knit exhibition at Dumfries House on the Cumnock Estate. The article that I'm going to link to down in the show notes says that the Library of Knit exhibition showcases the history of the traditional craft, features 100 colorful hand-knitted pieces using intricate techniques that have been developed over 40 years. And so that's the question I have is, they mean the techniques that have only been developed since the 1980s, or if that was a misprint and they meant 400 years? I really don't know, so I'd be curious to find out more. The Library of Knit has been curated by the Prince's Foundation and the Josepha Tedge Foundation in partnership with Sheila Greenwell and Di Gilpin, one of Scotland's most renowned designers and hand knitters, and aims to recreate communities of hand knitters with an interest in turning their hobby into a viable business. So again, I'll leave a link to that article down in the show notes. This tidbit came to me from Charlotte via a direct message on Ravelry. It's a video of several women spinning Erie silk in northeast India. They're using drop spindles, so something like this, not exactly. Theirs are lighter in weight, and the weight that you see at the top of my spindle would be at the bottom of theirs. But you get the idea that it's a spindle like this. The YouTube channel where the video is for a company called the Erie Silk Company. It's in Shillong, Meghalaya, India. So if you go to their YouTube channel page, you can see their channel trailer as well. And on that trailer, they talk about what their country or their company is and the women who are growing the silk cocoons, and they talk about the natural dyes they use and all the products that they produce. So it's pretty interesting. I will say that if you are interested in learning to spin, but maybe intimidated by the idea of the expense of the equipment, like of a spinning wheel, I did learn to spin on a spindle. And the whole reason I got the spindle was just to give myself a little bit of experience before the class that I was signed up to take that was going to use a spinning wheel. And the class I took on the spinning wheel included a rental of the wheel. So I didn't have to purchase a wheel ahead of time. And even just to get started with spinning, I could have done it with a spindle. So just like knitting is very portable, a spindle is very portable, and it is a low-cost entry point into spinning. Many people prefer a spindle over a spinning wheel. Personally, I prefer the spinning wheel, and some people will do either of them happily. So if you are slightly interested in spinning, but you're just not sure because of the cost involved, you can get spindles for a very small amount of investment and try it out. This next tidbit came to me from Frith to my email address. Frith sent me links to a TV program, an episode of a TV program called Country Calendar is I think what it was called. It was an episode on an alternative method of shearing sheep that a station in New Zealand has implemented. And then in addition, Frith sent a newspaper article about the backlash to this particular episode, as well as a radio interview. And so I didn't know, what any of it was about, and I looked at it. I because I don't live in New Zealand. If you don't live in New Zealand, you won't be able to watch the actual TV program, but you can read the article and listen to the radio program as well. And I'll also leave a link to the Sheep Station's website so you can see all of the practices that they are undertaking in order to create a carbon zero impact and also to treat their sheep as humanely as possible, reduce the stress level during the process of shearing. I thought it was interesting that there was apparently this backlash to what these people were doing in their practices. I suspect that because it's not traditional and it's different, that if your identity is with traditional farming practices, that you might feel that your identity is being attacked if somebody is doing something differently, or particularly if they say, oh, we think this might be a better way of doing things, or this is a way that we see is better for the animals, that some people see, well, if you think that's better, then you're telling me I'm wrong. I suspect that that might be what is behind the backlash. But here are the things that they did in order to reduce the stress levels of the sheep. Number one, they painted the inside of the shearing sheds white. They have 10,000 head of merino sheep. Merino sheep have very fine fleeces and kind of wrinkly skin, so they are a breed that apparently is more prone to getting nicked. And so by having the interior painted white, they are able to see any blood. It's like if the sheep accidentally got nicked, they would know it and then they could treat that little injury. The second thing that they do is that in these kind of larger sheep stations, it sounds like the shearing shed is maybe above ground, and so once a sheep is sheared, it gets sent down a chute. So it's like a 4 or 5 foot drop, and it's like on like a kid's slide almost. They go down this chute, and instead of landing on, say, gravel ground, where again they might get bruised or slightly injured, they just put a mattress at the base of the chute so they have a soft landing. So to me, it's like the difference between lifting your kid off the barber's chair and setting them down versus shoving them off and letting them land on the floor and like, nah, they probably won't get hurt. So it's sort of like, you know, why wouldn't you do something more gentle if you could? The third thing that they do is that the shearing sheds apparently start playing music about 6:30 in the morning when they start shearing. And a lot of times it's like AC/DC or it's like really hard rock. And they just shifted to playing other kinds of music. And the example that you could hear in the interview was that it was like classical music. So the whole point is to reduce the stress level of the sheep. So if the sheep aren't stressed and they're not fighting, then the shearers aren't going to be stressed and, you know, having a hard time. Everything's going to be a lot easier. So to me, these all seemed like really reasonable things to do. And thinking about the stress levels reminded me of this woman named Temple Grandin here in the US who designs slaughterhouses for cattle. She's autistic and she grew up with a lot of sensory overload information, and she recognized that the animals in these slaughterhouses were having the same kind of sensory overload stress responses that she had as a child, and she just figured out a more humane way to bring these animals in at a point that was going to be at the end of their life, but that it would be not stressful for them. So that just kind of reminded me of what was going on with reducing the stress levels of sheep. And I think, you know, change can be threatening to people who are used to doing things a certain way and believe that they're doing things the right way or an acceptable way, and being told that there could be another way might be what caused the backlash. It's hard to know. But anyway, again, I'm going to leave all those links down in the show notes. And if you live in New Zealand, you can watch the TV program as well as watch the interviews. This tidbit came to me on Instagram from Ifrat Couvent, who sent me a photo of a knitted sampler, which is in the collection of the Fries Museum in the Netherlands. So knitted samplers are sort of equivalent to a modern day stitch dictionary. So typically they are long strips of knitting. So you might have several multiples of a stitch pattern and work it for several repeats. And then you'd switch to a different stitch pattern. And so you end up with these long strips. You can frequently find these in folk museums all over Europe. You'll see these kinds of samplers, especially if there's some traditional knitting patterns in particular regions. You'll be able to see what was just really common from one region to another, versus sometimes you'll see certain stitch patterns that only appear in very few places. So you can kind of get an idea of what might be really specific to a particular region. So samplers were something that schoolgirls would have had to do in school when they were young, whether it was sewing or any kinds of needlework. And they didn't just learn how to do like fancy stitch patterns. They learned to sew basic garments, but they also learned how to repair and mend things. So part of the collection in the Frieze Museum are samplers that have different darning methods in them. Unfortunately, these samplers are not on display at the Frieze Museum. Most museums have only a very small percentage of their actual collection on display at any given time, and some things are never on display. So some museums, if they're not on display, they will have an online digital collection that you can look of things that they have. And unfortunately, the Frieze Museum not only doesn't have them on display in the museum, they don't have photos that you can look at in their digital collection. But I was able to find a blog post by Tom of Holland that was published in about, I think it was in 2014. It was when he was invited to go to the Frieze Museum to look at these knitted samplers, and he took photographs of all kinds of things, and it's really fascinating to see all of these items. For me, I enjoy seeing the beautiful pieces of fancy knitted work or sewing or whatever, but it's fascinating to me to see the literal reference materials, the practicing that people had to do in order to gain the skills to make those beautiful things. So I'll leave a link to both the museum, so if you're in the Netherlands, maybe you can go visit that museum, but also to the blog post from Tom of Holland, so you can look at all of his photographs and see those really amazing knitted samplers. Back in May, I started knitting a sweater that I reverse engineered from this commercially knit sweater. So my goal was to replicate sort of the size and shape of the sweater as well as the cables, but I did have to make some modifications. So the original yarn in this sweater is a cashmere chainette yarn in an Aran weight. So if you don't know what a chainette yarn is, I'll leave a link to a Technique Tuesday video above and also down in the show notes. The yarn that I am using for the sweater is a fairly standard sort of 3-ply worsted weight wool yarn. It's 90% wool, a sort of a Masham merino combination, and then 10% mohair. So this is the yarn that I'm using to knit the new version. But the main difference in the yarns I had to deal with was really just the gauge difference. So in order to get something that is the same size and shape, I needed to have more stitches and more rows, and I needed to alter the cable in order to achieve something that was the same size. So these original cables are 12 stitches wide. And the way that these crossings are worked is that you have 3 stitches crossing over 3 stitches on a right side row. And then on the next right side row, those 3 stitches cross the next 3 stitches. And then the next right side row, they cross the next 3 stitches. So it takes 3 crossing rows, right side crossing rows, for this 3 stitches to cross all the way over. The cables that I'm doing with my yarn have 15 stitches. So it takes an additional crossing row. So I have 4 right side crossing rows instead of 3. And then the repeat in the original is like 16 rows long, but in my version, it's 20 rows long. So my cables are very, very close in size. I really wanted to maintain sort of the proportions of these panels and the size of the cables when I made my version of the sweater. So aside from that, I made a couple of other changes. So in the original, the cables on all of the pieces all cross to the right. And I wanted, in my version, I wanted them to be mirrored on the front. So I have two cable panels over here that I can have those cables cross this way toward the V, and over here they can cross in this direction toward the V over there. That worked out just fine. And that's because I have this center button band that separates the two pieces. But the rest of the pieces have an odd number of columns. So there's 5 columns on the back, and then the sleeves start out with 3 and end up with 5 columns and then go back down to 3 for the cap shaping. So there wasn't really a good way to mirror the cables on the other pieces. So I spent a couple of years on and off trying to figure out experimenting with different ways that I could deal with this center panel in order to allow for the mirroring. And then in May, I decided to let go of that idea, keep the mirroring on the front, and then maintain the way it originally was for the rest of the sweater. Because I realized that these are very simple cables, it's a very repetitive pattern. There isn't really a way to change the center panel in a way that improves the design or at least keeps it neutral. There are ways of changing the central panel in order to allow for the mirroring, but they aren't, to my eye, an improvement. For example, just changing it to plain stockinette, to my eye, is not an improvement because the eyes are going to go to the center of the fabric first, and to have just a column of stockinette is not very interesting. And the original sweater had everything going in the same direction, and it's not something that is going to strike anybody as odd. So I did decide to mirror the cables on the front and keep everything the same. And once I'd finally made that decision, I was able to actually knit the sweater. So in May, I knit the first front replacement piece for the sweater, and I did make a change to the pocket. I wanted to have this pocket look different. But otherwise, I pretty much kept everything in terms of shaping exactly the same. And then the other thing that I did was I knit the back of the sweater. Now I kept all of the live stitches at the top of the front and the back, and I wanted to knit the sleeve for sleeve, and so that I could put together 3 pieces at one place to make sure that I liked how everything was coming together. So I did finish the sleeve this week. When I returned to knitting the sweater, I knit the first sleeve, and I'll be able to bring everything together this weekend. So let's go to the overhead just for a minute, and I'll show you up close what's going on with the different pieces. I didn't finish knitting the back. I wasn't sure how much longer I wanted it to be, and I wanted to do some shoulder shaping. So I wanted to get the back, one of the fronts, and then a sleeve done, and then see how it all came together at the sleeves. So I was looking at what I had done so far. So the back and the front obviously have to be the same length, and I can see that I had worked the front a bit longer, and what I was left with doing was shoulder shaping. And what I might end up doing is taking this back a few rows and doing the shoulder shaping. I ended on row 20 of the repeat, and it's a 20-row repeat, and here I think I ended on maybe row 16 or something like that. So what I might be doing is doing the shoulder shaping for here, starting from where I am right there, and then I'll end up with 20 rows, and then take this back a few, work the shaping so that I'll end back up with 20. So that these two pieces are the same length, and I have to see how the sleeve then fits into this armhole, because it's kind of a differently shaped sleeve cap an underarm shaping than I've done before, which is one of the reasons I wanted to replicate it pretty much exactly in terms of shaping. So I have and I need to wash and block everything because nothing had been blocked. I think I blocked the bottom half of the front when I was working on it to make sure that it was going to relax to the right shape. So I was a little worried because fabric, when you're first knitting it, tends to be a little tighter. It gets more drape and it loosens up after it's been washed, particularly with things like cables. So I soaked them all yesterday and let them dry overnight, and so that I could kind of see how things relaxed into it. And so I think what I am going to be able to do is do the shoulder shaping on this and the back, and then be able to fit the sleeve in, and then I'll be able to try it on. I'll have half the sweater kind of done, and I'll be able to try it on and see what I think of the fit, how it compares to the original. So I'll be doing that this weekend, is doing the shoulder shaping, seaming in the sleeve, and then I will start on this, either knit the second front or knit the sleeve. I'm not too annoyed having knit this sleeve. Sometimes I don't want to knit 2 sleeves in a row. And I know that I'm going to have to do some thinking about this left front because it's been a couple of months since I knit the right front, and I have to do the reversing, and I'm going to have to think through everything again. So I almost would rather knit the second sleeve because I don't have to think about what I need to do, and then end with the left front that I know I'm going to have to think things through before I knit it. So last week I was showing you that some handspun that I had done. I'd spun this. This is a BFL silk blend that I'd spun earlier in the spring, and then the past couple of weeks I spun. This is just regular BFL, but it's just 100% wool and it's natural colors. So last week I was trying to decide what I wanted to do with this, and I was thinking that I would want to dye it, and I was kind of asking you guys, had anybody ever done that where they dyed them together in the same dye bath, just to kind of, because I expect this would come out darker obviously than this would. And several people said yes, and several people recommended ChemKnits. Now I actually subscribe to ChemKnits YouTube channel. She's a dyer and she's a chemist, so she really can explain with a lot of accuracy and clarity how things work. So what I was thinking about was dividing these up into smaller skeins, and then like dyeing a cream one together with a dark one with the same color. I hadn't seen anything recently on her channel about that, so I did go and search just her channel to look for dyeing in mason jars, because my idea was maybe I could have some pint or quart size mason jars that I could have the dye solution in, put some mini skeins in there, and then have them all in my big canning pot at the same time, so that I could be dyeing them separately but at the same time. And so that was just the research I needed to do. And so I want to go to the overhead, and I'll kind of walk through what it is that my plan is going to be. Hopefully I can do it in this week. I'm waiting for some things to show up in the mail. Some of it came the other day, and I think some of it's not going to come until next week. So let's go to the overhead. So I have the cream that's got the silk sheen, and then I've got this sort of marled tonal natural colors. And one of the challenges for me with spinning is figuring out what to do with the yarn, because I have a really hard time with knitting projects trying to start with the yarn. I usually start with concepts when it comes to knitting, like conceptually, what is it that I'm trying to do? What techniques do I want to do? How do I want to structure this? How do I want to approach it? And I go through the whole process, and then the very last thing I do is figure out what yarn I'm going to use. And so the yarn is just the means for me to produce my idea. And when it comes to spinning, you're starting with, well, what kind of wool do I want to use? How do I want to prepare it? How do I want to spin it? What do I want to do for applying with it? And so you're creating this yarn, And then you're like, well, what am I going to do with it? I tend to knit socks and sweaters most of the time. Sometimes I knit hats, sometimes I knit other things, but I don't tend to knit projects that would need this amount of yarn. For me, the spinning is about learning more about yarn and the process, the tactile process of it, and all of that. So in some ways, my goals in spinning are very different from my goals in knitting, and I haven't quite figured out how to blend them together. But regardless, my number one goal is always to learn something new. And one of the things I did, I don't know, a year and a half ago maybe, I bought this dyeing kit from Clemis and Clemis. And so they're a company that makes tools for spinners, like I bought my drum carder from them, and I've bought some other tools from them. And they started selling this dye kit called Mother Mackenzie's Miracle Dye Mix. So this is by Judith Mackenzie, who's a world-renowned spinning teacher. And so it has all of these colors in it. And then it has some formulas for how to get different shades using these particular colors. One of the things that I was thinking I would do is to dye these two skeins like with the same color and see what happens when you dye a solid cream with this kind of marled natural color, like what the colors would look like. So initially I thought, well, I'll just pick a color and dye them both. And then I started thinking about it and I thought, no, what I think I want to do is to divide these up. I have almost 100 grams of each one. I have slightly over 100 grams of this one and slightly under 100 grams of this one. So I could divide them up into 5 skeins. So this one would have 19 grams and the skein from here would have 21. So I'd have 40 grams of yarn to dye. I certainly would save a snip of each of the original colors as a reference. And then what I thought I'd do is pick 5 colors and dye them together using the same dye mixture and see what happens when I dye with the same color. So my goal was to try to figure out, well, what 5 colors do I want to use? So I don't want to use brown or black. Like those I've eliminated immediately. I have 2, 4, 6, 7. So I have 9 colors altogether, but I only want to dye 5 skeins. So that leaves me with 7, and so I want to get rid of 3. So I don't like orange, so I get rid of orange. And then I need to get rid of one of these. Well, I know for sure I want to use yellow because I want to use something that's going to have a really low color value. So that's going to read very pale normally. And I want to see how much contrast there is between that when I have this. So I know I want to do yellow. Red's my favorite color, so I'm going to do red. And it'll be interesting to see something that's a deeper color, how that happens, what happens there. I love violet and magenta, so those are 4. So I'm left with 1 color besides that to do. So I could do blue or cyan. I think I'm going to go with the blue rather than the cyan. That's just kind of my thinking at the moment. So I think these are the 5 colors I'm going to do. I needed to get some equipment. I have a big canning pot that I've used for dyeing when I over-dyed a sweater in the past, but I needed some containers to hold the dye, and so I learned how to create a 1% dye solution, and I just need to wait for the rest of my supplies to show up so that I can do my experiment. So I have never been interested in quilt making. I mean, I'm interested in quilts and looking at them, but I've never been interested in quilt making. But recently I discovered there's this thing called a charm pack, which is a set of 42 pre-cut 5-inch by 5-inch squares of coordinating quilting fabric. So like it might be a quilt fabric designer who it's like their entire fabric line or something. And there may or may not be 42 unique squares. They might have some colors repeated in them, just depends on the pack. But I discovered this concept of a charm pack while I was watching a video of someone demonstrating how to do what's called chain piece, columns of patchwork pieces together, and then how to use a technique called nesting to sew together the horizontal rows. So the chain piecing is done for the columns, and then the nesting is done for the horizontal bits. So I'll link to the video that I was watching down below that introduced me to this concept. It's from a YouTube channel called The Wool Patch that creates videos based on the latest episode of The Great British Sewing Bee, which sadly we do not get here in the US, but I was able to watch the season anyway by downloading from a BitTorrent website. But the Wool Patch is a yarn and fabric shop in the UK, and Stuart is the owner, and he does a couple of Great British Sewing Bee related videos following each episode after it airs. And so I always enjoy watching those YouTube videos after watching the latest episode. So in March, I bought myself a new sewing machine for my birthday, but I haven't been using it that much. I've used it a little bit here and there, but just not very much. And I thought that piecing together a bunch of pre-cut squares that were color coordinated in order to learn a couple of new skills could be fun. So my old sewing machine couldn't have done chain piecing. So that was something that I was interested in seeing how it worked, because I just thought it was a really ingenious concept. After I watched Stuart's video on this technique, I thought, well, I'm going to go to a quilt shop. I'll find a quilt shop here in the Twin Cities. I found one, and they did not have charm packs. They had some pre-cut fabrics, but they're like fat quarters and things. And I didn't want to have to do the cutting. I didn't want to have to be precise about that. I didn't want to have to try to pick out colors. I just wanted to pick a charm pack. I have a slight color blindness, and even with yarn, picking yarn for like stranded color work, it's a stress for me, and I didn't want to be stressed about that. I wanted to do the equivalent of picking a ball of self-striping yarn where I knew the colors went together. So that quilt shop didn't have any charm packs. I went to Joann, which is our big box store here in the US. They have quilting fabrics and lots of quilting supplies, but they didn't have any charm packs. So I went online, and there's a company, I think it's called Missouri Quilting Company, and apparently they're like one of the largest quilt supplies and fabric stores in the country, and they had an overwhelming number of charm packs. So I picked this one, and they basically were in rainbow order. I just dealt them out like a deck of cards going 6 across. So I just laid it out like that, and then I made my little stacks of squares. I chain pieced them together. So for me, this was a really fun way to try something new. Try something new with my machine that I would never have been able to do before. Do something that was fairly simple. Do something where I'd be happy with the result, even if it's not perfect. I was not expecting perfection from myself. I was just hoping to learn some new skills, and I did. So let's go to the overhead, and I'll give you a little closer peek at what this quilt top looks like. So this is the quilt from overhead. I tried to get as much of it in here as I could. I did in no way at all a perfect job, but I learned a lot. So I think that is always my goal, is to understand what I'm trying to do, attempt it, and then realize where I went wrong and figure out how to do things differently the next time. So my whole goal for this project is to use my new sewing machine that I got myself for my birthday, to do something fairly simple. I have no aspirations for becoming an obsessive quilt maker at all. I loved the idea of being able to get a pack of 42 squares that were already cut, and that I could focus just on sewing straight seams and getting things lined up and kind of learning the whole chaining squares together, and then nesting them when I was doing the horizontal seams. And I think the biggest takeaway I got from this was that pressing for a quilt top is not the same as pressing other types of fabric. This is just something that I wasn't aware of, and it wasn't until I kind of screwed things up a little bit that I was like, wait, you know, how was I supposed to do this? And then I went and looked at some videos and went, oh, I did that wrong. Now I know if I ever do something like this again, I will have a better idea. So the next step for this is I need to go get some batting, and then I'm going to do the machine quilting. I'm going to do very simple, just straight quilting lines. And I have to figure out what backing to do with this. And then I have to do the binding. I have done binding on quilts twice before. I made quilts for my kids when they were little. They were these things I called affirmation quilts, and it was just a solid color of fabric on one side, a solid on the other. There was batting in there, and it was they were tied quilts, so there was no piecing, but I did have to do the binding. And I remember finding that process fascinating, that it worked and I was able to do it. But that was, see, almost 25 years ago, maybe, that I did that. So it's been a really long time since I've done that. But I will definitely be learning more in the next week or two in terms of getting this all quilted together and see what I end up with. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.